With many recognitions dim and faint, and somewhat of a sad perplexity, the picture of the year revives again. Internationally, 1965 was the year of Vietnam. In Canada, it was the year of the flag raising, the Dorion Report, and the election that nobody wanted. The birth of 1965 was heralded by the trumpets of economic prosperity, and it was heralded by an historical free trade agreement between the United States and Canada. January 16th, 1965, a cold day in Ottawa. Warm and windy in Texas, an agreement was being signed at the ranch of President Lyndon B. Johnson, an agreement that some observers saw as the first step towards complete economic union between the United States and Canada. The agreement was designed to achieve a substantial expansion in production and employment and to promote improved competitive efficiency in the Canadian automotive industry. External Affairs Minister Paul Martin made this statement following the signing.
The automotive agreement, which the Prime Minister and I have just signed, together with President Johnson and Secretary Rusk, is one of the most important commercial treaties ever made between the United States and Canada. It is the result of many months of careful preparation and close negotiation with our American friends. I am confident that it opens up exciting new prospects for the expansion of production and employment in the Canadian automotive industry. Our economy as a whole stands to gain, but I need hardly add that it is a source of rather special satisfaction for me that the benefits I confidently expect will be felt first and with the greatest impact in Windsor, my own city, and in other major centers of the industry.
At that exact moment, in Ottawa, Industry Minister Drury was making a statement.
The main features of the program are a mutually beneficial arrangement between Canada, or between the Canadian and the United States governments, and assurances of increased production by producers of motor vehicles in Canada. The agreement with the United States makes provision for both Canada and the United States to remove tariffs and other customs barriers on motor vehicles and components for their manufacture. It should be borne in mind that replacement parts are not included in the program. Under the agreement, the United States will seek early congressional authority to enact duty-free treatment for the Canadian products and to make this treatment retroactive. For its part, Canada will allow eligible automobile manufacturers to import vehicles into Canada and their components on a duty-free basis.
When Prime Minister Pearson arrived back, he was met by newsmen, and he recalled the lighter moments that occurred during the agreement talks.
Our talks were conducted in a very novel fashion. As soon as I got to Texas on the ranch, and the airstrip is right on the ranch, even before I was allowed to put my hat in my room, I was put in a cart and taken from a cart to a golf cart to a helicopter, and from a helicopter to a large ranch where there were a lot of deer, and we had a motor cavalcade there, and we started right in for 2 hours and a half, traveling around the Texas side. But during a lot of that time, we were talking business. He didn't get me on a horse. He confronted me when I arrived with a dog, the famous beagle. And even that frightened me. I asked if I had to ride it.
The plan would, among other things, achieve a substantial expansion in production and employment in the auto industry in Canada. Organized labor, as well as automobile and auto parts manufacturers, welcomed the plan as a bold and constructive measure in the national interest. John Diefenbaker has been called tenacious, determined, inflexible, and unyielding. But in the early months of 1965, he heard some new adjectives: pig-headed, obstinate, perverse, and blind. And even some of his own party went so far as to suggest he didn't realize when he was beaten, didn't know enough to give up. Conservatives were saying that John Diefenbaker could never again lead his party to victory, that the only one who didn't know it was George Diefenbaker. But the old showman had some strong supporters in caucus, men of unswerving personal loyalty who had hitched their wagons to his star before and were prepared to do so again. Léon Balsay, the member for Trois-Rivières, wasn't one of them. He believed, to the extent of threatening to cross the floor of the House, that Mr. Diefenbaker was totally out of touch with Quebec, that he was blind to the French fact, and, in this belief, he had much support from Quebec and many English-speaking conservatives who felt the Diefenbaker leadership had run its course. The storm clouds gathered. A demand was heard repeatedly for a leadership convention. Finally, a meeting of the National Executive was called in Ottawa to discuss the possibility of a convention. But canny John Diefenbaker wasn't to be outmaneuvered. He called a caucus for the day before. Léon Balsay was asked if he would attend.
I feel that the problem that we are faced with are problems of leadership and national policies, and I think the National Executive is well equipped. It's the proper body that is competent to deal with these problems, and I think calling a caucus, a party caucus for tomorrow, will not help matters and would just create embarrassment. And in my judgment, I feel that I better stay away from that caucus.
The old Tory warhorse received a resounding vote of confidence from the Conservative members of the House, and when the Executive met the next day, it was the opponents of the Diefenbaker leadership who found themselves outmaneuvered by the old campaigner.
As far as this meeting is concerned, this is an executive meeting. Leadership is determined at a national convention, and that leadership was determined in 1956 and is ratified subsequently on 2 or 3 occasions by national meetings. Conventions are only called when there's a vacancy, and I can tell you there's no vacancy as of this time.
John Diefenbaker won the round, but there were those in his own party who said that in saving his ego, he had lost an election. Their words were to re-echo on November the 8th. The flag debate of 1964 was one of the bitterest the House of Commons ever experienced, and threatened to split Canada's Parliament into 2 squabbling factions. But in 1965, the flag would fly, and indeed, February 15th, it did fly. Governor-General Georges Vanier saluted it.
As the red ensign is lowered, I salute it, and thank God for the blessings he bestowed upon it and us in the past. This is a time for rejoicing as well, because the flag of our country has been proclaimed by the Queen of Canada on the recommendation of the Canadian Parliament, and as it is raised, I salute it also and ask God to bless all those who will live and serve under it.
Prime Minister Pearson, with a heavy head cold and bundled against a brisk wind, made a speech that reflected the emotion of the moment.
If our nation, by God's grace, endure the 1,000 years, this day, the 15th day of February 1965, will always be remembered as a milestone in Canada's national progress. There are many in this country who regret the replacement of the red ensign by the red maple leaf, and their feelings and their emotions should be honored and respected. But I am sure that now that the decision had been made by the representatives of the Canadian people in Parliament assembled, that all Canadians as good patriots will accept that decision and will fly with pride and loyalty our national flag. The patriotic motives that have led Parliament to adopt a new Canadian flag do not include disrespect for our past
or for the emblems of that past. Today we salute the future, but we honor the past on which the future rests under this flag. May our youth find new inspiration for loyalty to Canada, for a patriotism based on no mean or narrow purpose, but on the deep and equal pride that all Canadians will feel for every part of this good land. God bless Canada.
Then, as the Queen's proclamation was read, while a volley of shots rang out and the red ensign was coming down, the maple leaf flag went up and flew over Canada.
Now know ye that by and with the advice of our Privy Council for Canada, we do by this our royal proclamation appoint and declare as the national flag of Canada upon, from, and after the 15th day of February in the year of our Lord 1965.
A dapper little man named Lucien Rivard will be easily forgotten by history. His unsavory associates even now can be scarcely remembered. But Rivard was the small, hard man upon whom careers founded and scandals spawned. And his name was associated with the charge that organized crime had reached its slimy tentacles into the upper reaches of government. The United States wanted to extradite him on narcotics charges and was represented in its attempt by Montreal lawyer Pierre Lamontagne, who, it was stated, was offered a bribe. Opposition and public pressure became so intense that heads began to roll, and Prime Minister Pearson's Quebec lieutenant, who was also the Minister of Justice, was accused of having used poor judgment in not asking for or taking the advice of his own law officers. The Prime Minister himself became involved when there was some question over the date when Justice Minister Favreau told him that the affair seemed to reach into his own office. To clear the air, the government appointed Quebec Chief Justice Frederic Dorion to investigate the affair, and in June, the Dorion report was released, which seemed to confirm that Mr. Favreau had been guilty of an error of judgment and also that the Prime Minister had misled Parliament. Mr. Favreau resigned as Minister of Justice, a difficult step.
There's not much I care to say in the circumstances. You will understand that all I can say is that my colleagues, all caucus, Prime Minister leading them, see, have been just plain wonderful, see.
Eric Nielsen, Conservative member for the Yukon, who had broken the Rivard story, saw the resignation as inevitable.
My personal feeling is one of regret, but the portfolio of justice leaves no room for errors of judgment and leaves no room for conduct on the part of the holder of that portfolio which will allow the Canadian people to have any doubt whatsoever in the security and the fairness in the administration of justice.
The Prime Minister was unhappy about the whole affair, but determined.
I don't think I need to emphasize my distress at losing Mr. Favreau as Minister of Justice. I agree with the decision that he has made. I don't think I need to emphasize also my gratitude to him for what he has done and to him for agreeing to remain in the government and serve his country. This has been a long, drawn-out, difficult, regrettable business. As soon as it became clear that something had to be investigated last November, we asked the Chief Justice of Quebec to investigate it. He has done that. He has made conclusions, and we will follow through on these conclusions. And we hope to clear up the difficulties, the dangers that have been exposed, and some were exposed, in the administration of justice in this country.
Days after the Dorion report had been released, a personal letter from Mr. Pearson resulted in the almost unprecedented event, a royal commissioner correcting his report after it had been completed, totally exonerating the Prime Minister. April 3rd, 1965, the third session of Canada's 26th Parliament prorogued on its 249th day of sitting after having experienced long, bitter debate, scandal, and the difficulties present in a parliament of minorities. April 5th, after a two-day respite, the third session of the 26th Parliament opened, the throne speech stressed that emphasis would be placed on the war on poverty. Prime Minister Pearson that day admitted some of the material in the speech from the throne was old, but he denied that any of it had been borrowed.
Well, some of it is old in the sense that we weren't able to get the program, all the proposals through in the last session that we had put on the order paper in the speech from the throne. That's quite true. We did a great deal last session, but we didn't complete our work. So far as the attack on poverty is concerned, President Johnson is doing that, but a lot of other democratic governments are doing it. And we have been doing it in our own way in Canada for many years. But this is a new and enlarged and intensified attack on poverty.
Tommy Douglas, leader of the left-leaning New Democratic Party, thought the throne speech had some good points, but felt the Liberals were slow in moving towards socialistic ideals.
I wouldn't mind if they were really moving toward it. I have the easy feeling that they've borrowed the slogans without the programs. They've got the words without the actions. They've cut the words but not the music. They talk about economic planning, for instance, so they set up an economic council. And what do? The economic council has no power. And now they're going to set up a secretariat to wage war on poverty. But what power is it going to have? What authority is it going to have? What money is it going to have? This is what we want to know. It's all right to talk about waging war on poverty. You can't wage a war until A, you've got some plans, B, you've got some troops, and C, you've got some weapons.
The leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition, John Diefenbaker, said the mess in the government, along with legislation to clean it up, was all that was missing.
It doesn't indicate any repentance for what has been found in connection with the unmoral proclivities close to the government, and there's no determination on the part of the government, nothing of the kind that you would expect that would indicate that what messes exist are going to be cleaned up.
The year 1965 was a year of major accomplishments for the Liberal minority government of Lester Pearson. On July 8th, the Prime Minister called a press conference to announce that tenders would be called in the autumn of the year for the Prince Edward Island Causeway. The causeway, an imaginative and exciting undertaking, would link the tiny east coast provinces of New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. A 5-year, $148 million combined tunnel, bridge, and causeway project would begin in April of 1966, and the Prime Minister, in making the announcement, was pleased.
This announcement culminates, as most of you, I suppose, know, about 10 years of detailed study. And it will, when completed, fulfill the dream of the maritime provinces, a dream which goes, I believe, even before Confederation. It was always considered, I think, Mr. McNaught, down in the island, that this was one of the terms under which Prince Edward Island came into Confederation.
Never any doubt.
In 1873. This is not the first time that this government in 2 years has taken hold of problems that have been talked about for 75 years and have done something about them.
One of the happy events of the year occurred in Ottawa, July the 14th, and it swelled the hearts of Canadians everywhere who had come to love and respect Governor-General Georges Vanier. It was rumored around Ottawa that the 77-year-old Queen's representative was considering retiring, and the problem was where to find a man who would command the respect and find a place in the hearts of Canadians as the Governor-General had done. But the Prime Minister had an announcement to make that day, and he called in the press gallery to state the Governor-General had agreed to remain in office for an indefinite period.
I can't really express adequately my feeling of appreciation and gratitude that he has been willing to do this. I think he and Madame Vanier have acted magnificently as the Queen's representative in Canada. We have been very fortunate to have had them in this position in the last 5 years, and it's good to know that they are going to continue to be at Rideau Hall.
Although Prime Minister Pearson's Liberal government was far from the end of the mandate it had received from the people of Canada in 1963, for some strange reason, almost from the beginning of 1965, the soothsayers on the Hill began to talk about a 1965 election. The rumors ebbed and surged, gaining impetus one day only to die away the next. But in midsummer, the recurring rumors of election began to seem more substantial. One highly regarded commentator would pontificate that an election was definitely in the cards for the fall of the year. The following day, he would be shot down in flames by another columnist. In late August, the Prime Minister made a Western tour. This was all the pundits needed. Obviously, he was going out to sound Western opinion. It must mean an election. Eventually, the election spirit caught up with even Mr. Pearson, and he began to joke and tease the commentators. But the teasing took on more serious tones, and on his return from the West, he stated that within a week he would come to a decision about an election and left for a few days at Harrington Lake, the prime ministerial summer home. Suddenly, on Tuesday, September the 8th, the announcement that the Prime Minister would make a national address that evening. This was what the nation had been waiting for.
I do not think we can follow any steady course if there are day-to-day uncertainties about the government having a majority in Parliament to get things done. Therefore, I have asked the Governor-General to dissolve Parliament now, so that there can be a general election on November the 8th.
Thus began what was called the election that nobody wanted. And within minutes of the Prime Minister's announcement, John Diefenbaker had condemned the decision to call it as unnecessary, inspired by a fear of meeting Parliament after the Dorion inquiry, and constituting a cynical disregard of the rights of Canadians. Throughout the long and frequently bitter campaign, the Prime Minister stressed the fact that he needed a clear majority to govern the country, a point of view that was widely derided by the leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition, and which, according to his opponents, was given the lie by the amount of important legislation that his recently dissolved government had been able to pass. It was charge and countercharge. For every argument of the Prime Minister's, Mr. Diefenbaker had an answer, and if it wasn't he, NDP leader Tommy Douglas, Socrat Robert Thompson, or creditiste Réal Cowett put in their oars and, on occasions, made a strong point of their own. In kicking the campaign off, Lester Pearson pointed to the Conservative Party and laughed at their apparent lack of unity.
The current maneuverings inside the Tory party recall the words of Lewis Carroll in The Hunting of the Snark. Words used incidentally this week in a news magazine in a somewhat different context. And these words are, "But the valley grew narrow and narrower still, and the evening got darker and colder, till, merely from nervousness, not from goodwill, they marched along shoulder to shoulder."
John Diefenbaker denied his party was lacking in unity.
There's a new feeling of unity in this party, and in every part of Canada. Oh, in the old days, they used to have one of those fellows go through the country with a horse, and he used to have a long horse whip, and he'd flip. He could pick off this, that, and the other thing. Finally, one day, he picked off a bee's hive, and he did it well. Somebody said, "Try out that one. It was a hornet's nest." He said, "Oh, no. They're organized." And I draw the line there. Well, we're organized in unity, and Mr. Pearson didn't know that when he called the election.
Mr. Pearson outlined his reasons for calling the election.
The primary reason for this election is that today there are major issues and problems facing Canada, and that in dealing with them, the federal government can do the best possible job only if it has the support of a parliamentary majority based on the confidence of Canadians in all parts of the country. For this purpose, I am asking for a clear mandate
so that our country can have the leadership and the strength in Ottawa needed to get on with the basic tasks, maintaining our economic expansion, improving social security, providing equal opportunity for all Canadians, in short, to get on with the essential job of building up the new Canada.
Nothing was said about the flag in the election campaigns of 62 and 63. Nothing was said and action was taken. Nothing was said about policies setting up within this nation associate states. On and on they go. Unity for Canada, built on two flags, two pension schemes, two types of national organization insofar as Dominion-provincial relations are concerned, and two types of laws, one for the rest of us and the other for banks and bananas and mananas and all that other kosher.
While all this was going on, Tommy Douglas, leader of the New Democratic Party, was stumping the country from coast to coast.
I am confident that we can make a major breakthrough because we are in the mainstream of world thought. Time is on our side. And I promise you that we will put on the toughest, the most effective, and the most aggressive campaign that has ever been put on by our party.
In the days ahead, we will be carrying on some of the most important negotiations the province is in our history. It will be a good thing for Canada to have a strong federal government in Ottawa to speak for Canada in these negotiations. And we propose to do that.
And look at that government as I look at them. Reminds me so much of a cushion on a sofa which bears on its surface the shape of the last person that sat on it.
Taxation and financial problems are looming up. The report of the Tax Structure Committee reallocating financial resources between the provinces and the federal government. Important trade negotiations. Improved social security. Negotiations with the provinces over Medicare. The war on poverty and the fight for equal opportunity. All these things require a strong government in Ottawa.
And Mr. Pearson says, you know, I've launched a war on poverty. I'm impressed. He said, I've appointed Tom Kent as director of the war on poverty. And that impressed me, too. And they elevated his salary from about $12,000 to $25,000. He won his war on poverty.
We must never become so obsessed with arguments about methods, which will vary from time to time and region to region, that we lose sight of the one thing which distinguishes us from all other parties, namely the goals and objectives of a society which guarantees equality of opportunity for every Canadian. To do that, we must curb the power of the corporate elite, and in a democracy, that means political action. We might as well recognize now that politics has to do with power and who shall exercise it. The choice that is facing this country is whether political power will be used to preserve the privileges of the economic elite or be used to meet the needs and aspirations of the Canadian people.
October 8th, the Los Angeles Dodgers and the Minnesota Twins were battling it out for the World Series. And October 10th, the deciding game was played. Los Angeles emerged victorious, defeating the Twins 4-3. In Canada, the election campaign continued. Robert Thompson, the leader of the Social Credit Party, was speaking in Red Deer, his home constituency.
I'm quite convinced that Mr. Pearson has made the greatest blunder of his political career in calling this election. You know, he sent the pollsters around the country to find out how many seats they could win. And one of these private polling organizations came back and told him he could win 165. And he backed that up with the remarks of some of his campaign and strategy people who even told him he was going to get 6 or 7 seats in the province of Alberta. And I think against his better judgment, he was forced into this election that he didn't want, and I'm convinced practically nobody else in Canada wants either.
We have tackled the most difficult problems. We have made the tough decisions. We have faced up to the necessity for action arising out of these decisions. And I make bold to say that the record over 2.5 years, almost 2.5 years, is a good one. Universal old age pension, $75. And when we reach 1970, it'll be $75 at 65 years of age. A Canada pension plan, including protection for widows, children, and disabled, making sure that these benefits will be available to all Canadians across the country. A Canada assistance program for those who need help even under the pension scheme that we have. A national labor code, a national flag, which they said couldn't be done, that we wouldn't try to do it.
Who does Mr. Pearson think he's fooling when he says that he needs a majority in order to bring in collective bargaining for civil servants? Who would have voted against collective bargaining for civil servants if he had brought it in? Would he have had any trouble getting the New Democratic Party members to vote with the government to pass this legislation? He would have had no trouble passing this legislation. The thing is that Mr. Pearson didn't have the courage to bring in this kind of legislation. And therefore the responsibility for not having this legislation passed lies with him, not with the fact that he didn't have a clear majority. As a matter of fact, I strongly suspect that if Mr. Pearson were to be so fortunate and Canada so unfortunate as to have a clear Liberal majority, the chances are he'd do even less with a majority than he's done with a minority. Because I think the Liberal Party, as it did for 22 years, when it had a majority, would do now what it did then, roll over and go to sleep.
There was a marked feeling, as support for the Conservatives seemed to blossom, that John Diefenbaker was pulling his party up by the bootstraps, and that the old campaigner, showman extraordinary, might just have a chance to pull it off. This possibility was particularly marked as the Prime Minister's advisers were keeping him pretty close to home base, limiting his trips outside Ottawa, almost as though they were trying to keep him remote or above the hurly-burly of political campaigning. And it was during this period that a new phrase crept into the political lingo, campaigning by press release, as day after day pronunciamentos flowed from Parliament Hill over the signature of Lester B. Pearson, Prime Minister. And so, to November the 8th, and the election that nobody wanted ended in the election that nobody won. All over Canada that night, people were glued to their radios, listening as the returns were brought to them instantaneously, and it soon became apparent that Lester Pearson would not get his majority. Before the returns were completely in, the Prime Minister addressed the nation.
It may well be that no party will have a majority in the House of Commons. I think that that is a disappointing result, naturally, because I campaigned, among other things, on the desirability of this country having a government with a majority in the House of Commons. And I think the continuation of a minority government in the House of Commons presents problems both for Parliament and for the country. I have nothing further to say on that matter. My colleagues and I will naturally be assessing the situation in the light of the returns when they are final, though they won't be final for a few days because of the service vote, but we will be meeting Wednesday morning at the Cabinet and we'll be assessing the results at that time. And in our assessment, we will be concerned only with one thing. That is what is best for the country.
The leader of the opposition, John Diefenbaker, spoke to the country from his home riding in northern Saskatchewan.
To me, it was something beyond any ordinary campaign. It was Canada, its future, the determination of the course that this nation would take. It was the reaction of the people that I'll always recall, the kindnesses shown to my wife and me throughout, That's what carried me through. That's what upheld my hand. No one can look into the future. That is denied us. But I can say one thing. I have devoted the years of my life, the full span, to this country. That devotion has been repaid over and over again by the fact that Canadians have given to me, in my custody, their hopes and their aspirations.
The final standings after the service vote was counted were Liberals 131, Conservatives 97, NDP 21, Credit East 9, Social Credit 5, Independents 2. Another minority government for Canada. 3 days after the election, Finance Minister Walter Gordon, a slight, mild-mannered man, resigned from the cabinet of Lester Pearson, ostensibly for giving his leader poor advice in calling an election. The resignation, according to the Prime Minister's office, was accepted with regret, for Walter Gordon had been a long-time friend and was often hailed as the spark plug of the new political image of the Pearson cabinet. He was also one of the most controversial members of that same cabinet. After much pressure from the news media, Walter Gordon called a news conference to explain his reason for resigning.
I had been one of those who had been among the strongest advocates of an election. I think that I thought then that it was desirable to have a strong government in Canada. I haven't changed my mind about that a bit. I think that it would have been better to, if the results had been such that some party would have had a majority. I told the Prime Minister at the time that as I felt strongly about this, and as I was the chairman of the campaign committee, that I would feel that if the results didn't produce a majority, that I should resign. Well, I was one of those who thought we'd done a damn good job and that people would want us to continue to do that job, and I didn't agree with those who thought that a minority situation was the one that would ensure that sort of thing.
And on November 27th in Toronto, the Hamilton Tiger Cats, in a game with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, took the Grey Cup Classic again for the East. The score was 22-16. Ottawa then became quiet. The press gallery emptied as reporters journeyed home for the Christmas holidays. Only a few typewriters were heard clacking away as the ones who remained behind went on keeping the nation informed as to the events on Parliament Hill. New Year's Eve in the House of Commons, a time for reflection, a time to hear the echoes of speeches made by Canada's great men, Macdonald, Laurier, Cartier. The echoes of another famous speech were heard that night in the Commons. The words of Governor-General Vanier were heard again, the words he spoke when the flag was raised at the beginning of 1965.
I appeal to all Canadians to set aside pettiness, selfishness, and intolerance where these may exist, and to cultivate a spirit of brotherhood and mutual confidence. I hope and pray that Canadians will in this way give an example of fraternal coexistence, and that our flag will symbolize to each of us and to the world the unity of purpose and high resolve to which destiny beckons us.